pressing the button. You are live. Woohoo!
This is Daddy's drink.
Hello. Welcome to Virtual TrekCon 6. We are live. Hello. So our hosts today are the Matt Boardman, Jenny R. Johnson, I'm Elise
I guess we're all saluting today, yeah.
And our very special guest is writer and producer of Prodigy, Star Trek Prodigy, Aaron J. Waltke.
Hello.
Thank you for being here, and introduce everyone to your special guest.
Yes, this is the special guest, this who has made a few scant appearances on a few Star Trek podcasts. The youngest Trekkie in our household, Ramona.
Oh my gosh. And what a name too. Well done.
Such a great name.
We wanted something a little bit old school, but one that wouldn't mark her for mockery.
Totally.
That is the toughest thing about choosing kids' names, because you're going through it and you're like, and then you start going through all the ways that kids could make fun of their name, you know?
Yeah. I mean, having a last name Waltke, my dad said he was walkie-talkie from Milwaukee. That was what they used on it.
Amazing.
Walkie-talkie from Milwaukee. So let's dive in here and talk about all things Aaron Waltke and Star Trek Prodigy and oh, I did have a question. I thought about this last night when I was trying to go to sleep. And then I saw that you posted on social media about the Hugo Awards. It's Hugo Awards season.
Yes.
And could you tell us a little bit about that and how a nomination for Prodigy would help?
Sure. So, I mean, the Hugo Awards, such as they are, one of the more prestigious fan-voted awards out there. In order to vote, I believe you either have to be a member of the National Science Fiction Society or International, the World Science Fiction Society, or you have to be attending Worldcon either last year or this year. So basically, it would be like if you went to everybody at a specialized Comic-Con and said, what are your favorite TV shows and movies and books of the year? And, they've been around for decades now and have launched the careers of a lot of really famous science fiction authors, and have since become very well regarded for TV and film as well. And so I was delighted to see that every year fans put together a collective list of what they think are the best science fiction and fantasy books and TV shows in sort of like a group consolidated list. And Star Trek Prodigy had made the list. So I figured may as well just get the word out, and if people deem it worth a Hugo nomination, that would be amazing for our show. Anything to bring attention to it at this time, especially as we're trying to find out what the next steps are for Prodigy. That any publicity helps for sure. And it's within reason that we could get a Hugo nomination. I think Lower Decks and other Star Trek shows have certainly received Hugo nominations and or wins. A few years ago, She-Ra, the Netflix reboot, received a Hugo nomination. So it felt like something that was worth just letting the fans know if they like the show. That's one way to support us.
Fantastic. Yeah, I didn't realize. I like I'm very familiar with the Hugos as an entity, but I didn't understand how they were voted on before. That's really interesting and
Yeah,
cool.
it's you think that all award shows are just sort of these elite
Mhm.
blue ribbon panelists in some ivory tower somewhere, but everyone has their own rules.
Yeah.
The Emmys are voted on by Emmy voters.
Mhm.
The Oscars obviously are voted on by the Academy, but other organizations have different methods, and the Hugos are for all intents and purposes fan voted. So
Man.
that's what's kind of makes them special that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna
Yeah.
say, it's one thing to have people who are, labeled experts. It's another thing to have people who actually watch the show say, "Hey, you know what? We think that this is worthy of an award."
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Man.
So, I think the window, if you haven't already bought a ticket for Worldcon to nominate it, that might be closed for new people. But
Mhm.
if we make the nominations, then I think you can then, but you just have to be a member of the World Science Fiction Society, which is, I think, a nominal fee. Or if you buy a digital ticket to Worldcon, which is pretty cool anyway, because you can attend a bunch of cool panels, not unlike this one with your favorite science fiction,
Oh, no way.
fantasy authors, and that sort of thing. And I don't think it's that expensive. Then
Mhm.
you could certainly help us out. Then are you just making faces? So I'll certainly keep people updated to see,
Yeah.
if we're lucky enough to get a nomination. I'll let folks know how and where they could potentially help us secure a win.
Amazing.
Oh, cool.
That's awesome. Because it would
What?
certainly be deserved. Well
Yeah.
deserved.
I'm curious as to what Ramona is munching on.
Is it noisy? Sorry, they're yogi,
No, not at all.
No.
Not at all.
yogi
She
yogurt
just-
melts.
She seems to be
Ooh.
enjoying them very much.
Oh yeah, but melts are like one of her favorite snacks. They're basically
That's awesome.
freeze-dried yogurt.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Man. So taking it back to like the beginning, I'm curious because I'm not entirely familiar with your through line, and I saw in doing a little research that you were involved in the theater coming up through school.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
Um,
so
so yeah,
Mhm.
I can take you all the way back.
Yeah.
And you know, before I even attended college, I was always kind of interested in storytelling in some way or another. I was of that certain age
Mhm.
in the late 80s and early 90s where I found my parents' camcorder and
Nice.
spent all day every day on the playground with my friends just endlessly talking about Dune and Lord of the Rings anyway.
Mhm.
So
Oh, fun.
we thought it was amazing that we could actually make our own movies,
Yeah.
especially when we realized we could stop the camera and then move the camera and then start it again and do an
Mhm.
in-camera edit. That opened up a whole new world for us. So when it came to TV and movies, I decided that was kind of what I wanted to pursue in college.
Mhm.
But I became really enamored with theater, and I wound up pursuing sort of like a minor in theater while going to Indiana University Bloomington.
Gotcha.
And so I directed a number of plays,
Oh.
and
Ah.
I also got involved in the sketch comedy group there, which I think is still going
Amazing.
now 30 or 40 years old, which is
Mhm.
kind of crazy to say.
Yeah.
Um, um, so we would put on a brand new 2 hour show every other week, which nobody told us that was insane. We just
Oh my
thought that's what you're
gosh.
supposed to do. Which wound up being great training for working in
Mhm.
Hollywood because you are expected to churn out, scripts very quickly and be able
Mhm.
to redo things. And we basically ran it like a TV room inadvertently, where you just come in every week with a few sketches you'd written, submit it
Right.
for the other people in the comedy troupe, and if some people either would get in or they'd say, if you make these changes, then I will vote for it to get in. on the second round, and then
Mhm.
you know, if it didn't make the cut, it didn't make the cut. But so you'd have to kind of learn how to revise and take notes and all that, and it was a really great experience. And I even wound up doing a little bit of it here in Los Angeles as well. Um,
Oh, cool.
and I performed at UCB and um,
Wow.
now
Cool.
defunct IO West in Hollywood, and had a house show there with my sketch comedy friends. And then we would also just take some of our best sketches, and we would, you know, film them and either show them in the theater or put them online in places and stuff. And it was a great kind of way to build a reel and for when I
Mm,
moved out to Hollywood.
Yeah.
yeah.
But I love working in theater. I don't know if I have the talents that some of my quote unquote like actor friends do.
Mm.
Like, you know, for them, I have some friends that you could be like, hey, can you do like King Lear? And they'll just start reciting King
Oh my
Lear and do the
God.
entire play
Gosh.
off the
Oh,
top of their head. I'm
Mm.
not built that
yeah.
way.
Yeah.
I have to rote memorize any sketch or performance I'm doing. And even then, there's like a 20% chance I'll enter what they call the white room, where your brain just doesn't remember anymore.
Uh-huh.
And it's just panic town. Um, but I kind of feel a little more comfortable, you know, on the other side of things.
Yeah.
And that's where I kind of found my calling, I think.
Nice.
So once you were in Los Angeles, what was the thing that sort of broke it open for you? What was the
Mhm.
Oh, that's an interesting question because, like, people tend to talk about like big breaks as
Mhm.
if some guy with chomping a cigar
Right.
will pull up in a limousine and say, "You kid, you look like you got the it factor. Get in
Mhm.
here. We're going to the A list." But I that doesn't typically happen. It can,
Yeah.
but usually when you hear about stories like that, it's kind of like a PR thing that
Mm,
hides a lot of the legwork that took them up
Right.
to that point. Uh,
yeah.
and for me, like most people, it was more like a lot of little to medium breaks that slowly
Right.
kind of snowballed into something resembling a curriculum vitae. um,
Mhm.
and so, you know, my first job in Los Angeles, speaking of that sketch comedy group that I was a part of, one of my friends who was in it moved out to Los Angeles a year ahead of me. And while I stayed behind and tried to finish up a documentary that I was making for PBS
Oh, cool.
in Indiana, and he wound up landing a job which wound up effectively being he was being paid minimum wage to write jokes for a production company called National Lampoon, which you may be aware of. They
Oh,
did
Yeah.
like, you know,
yeah.
Animal
Done a few
House
things,
and Van
Mm.
maybe.
Wilder
Oh, yeah.
and the Chevy Chase vacation movies and that sort
Mhm.
of thing.
Right.
Well, this would have been about 2005, 2006. Yeah, daddy's wearing glasses. um, you know, they started to dabble in this newfangled thing called YouTube, where
Uh-huh.
it seemed like everybody was you know, trying to make money off it. To give you an idea how long ago this was, YouTube didn't even have advertisements on it yet. So
Right.
it was
Remember
literally
that.
just you just
Yeah.
upload videos and question mark, and then profit question mark.
Mhm.
um,
Yeah.
I think the idea was like if you get big enough, then you might get sponsorship for future videos where you effectively make low rent commercials for them. That was the model
Oh,
back
crazy. Yeah.
then. And
Yeah.
Mhm.
National Lampoon wanted to get in on that space. So they started to put together a team that would be able to produce short form sketch content as well as like half hour sort of variety show type content. For They had a college television network. I don't, you know, I don't even know if they do it anymore,
Right.
but at the time colleges had this sort of closed circuit TV
Mhm.
that that college students would have access to when they went in the dorms. And so National Lampoon had a network of something like 200 college television stations that
That's
that they could
crazy.
syndicate 2 hours of content for every other week, and so they needed people to produce to fill that time, and so we made like 4 different shows and would package them together and would broadcast to this network of colleges that supposedly served about 3 million college students. MTV had a similar thing at the time called MTVU that did the exact same thing.
Crazy.
Wow.
Yeah, interesting, huh? So my first, I went out there and basically said, "Hey, clearly you need somebody that can write and produce and edit that can do everything. I can do that. You don't have to pay me a lot, but just pay me something."
Yeah.
And so my first job was as a writer and producer at National Lampoon.
Wow.
That's fantastic.
Through that, I got to make a bunch of fun comedy sketches with a lot of rising stars through like the Comedy Store and the improv, Hollywood Improv, and many of whom are now pretty famous now. But at the time, all their agents were like, "Hey, you should do something with the internet. These guys are doing stuff. Just here's a roll." Back then, to give you an idea of how long ago this was, they literally had a binder that was about this thick that they dropped off from like CAA and WME or whatever, and said, "Here, boom, there's our client list. If you need to use any of them, just let us know."
Amazing.
And while I was doing that, I spent nights and weekends making sketch comedy and making short films and stuff. And eventually, I got hired to write a couple of projects. Like I wrote a live action CGI hybrid film for the company that did the Stuart Little films, if you remember those. With Michael J. Fox, and then also Alvin and the Chipmunks, which were huge. And so those wound up. You went down. The top of the pin fell. That's so they wound up having this business model where they had the rights to a bunch of beloved children's properties and said, "Can you update these to be 4-quadrant live action films?" And myself and my writing partner at the time took a look at the list, and there was this really great show, or a great movie from our childhood called The Brave Little Toaster. That was sort of a cult hit on VHS for Disney, and they had acquired the rights to the book. And I was like, "I don't know how you got the rights to this, but I loved that film as a kid." And went on and on talking about how it was how it had all these great themes about the importance of taking care of what you own and the evils of planned obsolescence and that sort of thing. And they were like, I don't know what you said in there, but they want you to write the Brave Little Toaster movie. So that was kind of my first big break. Working in features. Wound up writing a couple other movies or projects for them. I think I wrote a movie treatment for Heathcliff, if you remember the old Heathcliff comic strip. And then wound up and slowly sort of accumulating work that way. She's playing with a banjolele back there. I don't know if you hear that. No. And eventually some of our work landed on the desk over at DreamWorks, and they were developing a project which later became Guillermo del Toro's Troll Hunters. And since we have sort of an action adventure sensibility, they said this would be perfect for this project if and when it comes to pass. And sure enough, 8 months later, they called us out of the blue and said, "Hey, do you want to come work on this Guillermo del Toro project?" And of course, we said yes.
Of course.
And that was gosh, like 11 years ago now, 12.
Wow,
and it's been sort of like nonstop ever since.
So
fantastic.
Cool.
Awesome. Yeah.
It's always so cool just hearing creatives just how because like you say, it isn't just one thing, and it's just so cool to see that journey. It's something I'm fascinated
Yeah,
by,
I'm always
honestly.
happy to share because
Mhm.
you know, I think there is, while I understand why there is that illusion of like this is
Yeah.
the new Wonderkind who came out of
Mhm.
nowhere and the new person that's
Right.
ever, but
Yeah.
I you know, and that does kind of erase a lot of the hard work and development that any artist
Mhm.
or creative person has to go through. You
For
know,
sure.
I've had a number of people gave me advice when I was starting out, that was essentially came down to don't be afraid of failure because everybody writes, you know, you have to write like the first 5 bad scripts and then you'll
Mhm.
start writing the good ones. So just get those out of your system and,
Yeah.
you know, each time just try to learn a little bit more and figure out
Mm.
what you like and what your voice is, and then try to find ways to you know, to both improve and on that, and just keep pursuing what
Yeah.
makes you excited about your art,
Mm.
and that's how you will eventually
Mhm.
find success.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, I
And
think it's cool too that like I don't know if you found like where you're at now is not necessarily where you started off with your intention, right? It's like all of a sudden now you're doing this, but you started off you know, in one direction.
Yeah,
Mhm.
you know, I revered great writing. I loved great writing, but I think I always had a little bit of a complex. Like I don't know if anything I write will ever be as good as the stuff that I love. And
Mhm.
so I for a long time I assumed I was going to wind up as a director, like somebody who could appreciate great
wow.
writing and maybe
Mhm.
provide
Yeah.
direction on where I thought the good stuff was, but that, you know, I wasn't sure if I'd ever be good enough to be able to create whole cloth from nothing, you know, worlds and characters. And yeah, I think it kind of slowly dawned on me that there is no kind of secret sauce, and sometimes you are just in the room and nobody really knows anything and you're the only one who has something of a vision of what could be
Uh-huh.
good, and
Yeah.
that's kind of like the man behind the curtain of it all is, you know, there is no mystical, you know, Avalon that artists emerge from. It just comes
Mhm.
down to people that have a passion and a vision and are willing to kind of explore their way through the forest until they find
Mm.
something incredible that will probably surprise even them. And I think that
Mhm.
that aspect of the creative process slowly dawned on me. I was like, oh, I had to give myself permission to say, I think this is good enough to
Right.
stand on its own.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah.
You have that
Well,
moment
who
where,
are
wait a minute, I'm the person in the
yeah.
room that
Yeah,
has
I like
I
yeah, all
hear
of us
yeah.
all of us have imposter syndrome for sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
But sometimes you
so
have to realize there's like, well, if I don't do it, no one will.
Mhm.
yeah.
Yes, this is true. What you were talking about, not feeling like you were as good as some of the writers that you may have aspired to be. Who are some of those writers that inspired you or thought, well, I could never
Sure.
write something like that?
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of alluded to it earlier. I would some authors that had a pretty profound influence on me when I was younger. Um, uh, Tolkien was a
Mm.
pretty big influence. I think Frank Herbert was big. And then also just some fantasists out there like, you know, Roald Dahl
Mhm.
and uh, Ursula K. Le Guin, and
Mhm.
eventually Asimov and even H.G. Wells. You know,
Oh, yeah.
Mm.
I read War of the Worlds and The Time Machine at a very influential time in my life,
Oh,
and
cool.
Yeah.
you know, I don't think I've ever quite escaped that fascination and love of that sort of like, you know, steampunky kind of
Mhm.
where science and madness meet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And obviously Star Trek was a huge influence on me as well. You know, especially because, as any true Star Trek fan knows, it contains multitudes, and
Mhm.
Yeah.
you know,
Mhm.
it's almost like a gachapon where every episode of Star Trek is going to introduce you to a pretty solid version of any number of genres, whether it's a Western like Fistful of Datas or
Mhm.
a submarine movie like Balance of Terror, like it could, or
Yeah.
a comedy like Trouble with Tribbles, like it has everything in it. And so that
Yeah.
definitely just downloaded a love of genre into my brain. But also, I love, for that same reason, I loved anthology shows. Twilight Zone, Rod Serling was a huge influence on me, especially because of his unapologetic embrace of like, the form in this sort of like larger than life kind of using science fiction as a blatant metaphor for important social issues,
Right.
and saying
Yeah.
like, "Do you get it now?" Like, I love that.
Love that.
But yeah,
Actually,
I mean, I was, I guess, in retrospect, I guess I was a bit of a classicist in that a lot of these are not like obscure, but they definitely
yeah.
molded and warped my brain in ways that are probably irrevocable.
But for
Um,
the better. But for the
one,
better.
yeah, one Trek fan in the live
Oh,
chat said, did you ever read Heinlein?
Yes, I did
mhm,
read Heinlein, although it was a little later in life. It was high school and college,
mhm.
specifically Starship Troopers,
Right.
and I think some of his short story collections I did dabble in,
Mhm.
and he's a very interesting guy.
Yeah.
His like he's a great science fiction author and world builder. His outlook and like his politics are very hard to untangle.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
He very clearly had his own worldview. But
Mhm.
I guess sometimes that's kind of the fun of diving into somebody's, uh, um, their body of work, and that's kind of the purpose of art in many ways is
Yeah.
to be exposed. It's the closest we have as a species to being able to dive into someone else's brain and saying this
Yeah.
is how you feel about things, and construct, you know, a pretty substantial sort of concept of how a different person thinks, because
Mhm.
Yeah.
we're all islands, kind of sending smoke signals at each other, and to be able to spend a few hundred pages, deep diving into how people's minds work is
Yeah.
a great
Yeah.
process for anyone to go through.
So
Yeah.
in relation to that, so you go into a writer's room, how does that work as a team? Like,
Well,
Right.
I mean, that's a great question, and that's kind of, I think, a great writer's room is built out of a lot of different voices that have
mhm,
different perspectives. Sometimes when you're hiring people uh, for a writer's room, you have to really look at it from the perspective of, almost like the A team, where where you
mhm.
have to,
Mhm.
Yeah.
if you, let's say you have 5 writer slots that are budgeted, you don't want to just hire 5 people that can all do the same thing exactly the
Right.
same way. It's not, yeah, she thinks it's a phone.
Hey.
Ring ring, hello.
It's so cute.
um you want to hire people that both can do the job, can write a
Mhm.
solid
Right.
script and know story structure and know character, but maybe have sort of specializations or angles of attack that complement each other rather than overlap completely.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Some, you might have one person who's really good at like snappy dialogue and taking, thorny, complicated scene work and condensing it down to just like a really great back and forth where the subtext is as equally clear as the text,
Mhm.
and whatnot. Or maybe you need somebody who's just really good at always focusing on character and finding those emotional truths and tracking across the season. Where are they at with their own personal journey, and how
Mm.
can that fold
Mhm.
into the episode of the week that you have to be tackling? And you might have somebody who's really good at structure, that
Right.
they think almost entirely in an episode and seasons, beginnings and endings and middles, and how to hit those peaks and valleys of emotional truth.
Mhm.
And then, if I wanted to just be a solo artist that was just unleashing my genius on the world, I would go live in a cave and try to write try to write the great American novel.
Yeah.
That doesn't interest me. I like the most fun thing in the world for me is to surprise even myself at the directions and the places that we can find the story.
Right.
And so that's the great benefit, I think, of a writer's room is you create essentially a brain trust that can provide a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different answers in order to find the best one.
And so what is your thing?
My thing,
Yeah.
I think you've hit a nerve. The Midwestern in me is like afraid to
I know what you mean.
talk about what I'm good at.
I feel that. I feel that
Yeah.
deeply.
I'll put it this way. I have been told that the reason I have done fairly well for myself as a screenwriter is because I'm pretty good at, or if not pretty solid at all of it. But I would say I tend to look at things from a structuralist perspective, but also what has the greatest emotional resonance for the themes that we are exploring. Like those are the two things that I think all great stories have underpinning them, and the rest of it is like delicious icing on the cake, which you always want to make sure there's great icing. But if the story is not about something and it's not constructed well, audiences subconsciously or not will notice and say, that was like a B-.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty good at pushing that over the edge to at least get into the A territory.
Amazing.
Nice.
Well said. That's great.
I would agree. I would
is
agree.
great.
Yeah. I mean, just looking at just the stuff that you've done for Prodigy, Troll Hunters was fantastic. There's just, I mean, it's deeply rooted in I think if we can connect to those stories, it makes them that much better. And
Yeah.
I can say for the episodes that you have written for, since we're talking about Star Trek for Prodigy, you can. There's a human aspect, like you said. Star Trek was always about something, and I think that you have a great gift, shall we say,
Thank you.
well, you under, it's like what was the phrase today? You understood the assignment.
Yeah.
And that's what it is. It really is. I mean, you hear the episodes that people talk about that they love the Prodigy, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's an Aaron J. Waltke led story. So.
Yeah, I mean it's always delightful when people list their favorite episodes that I'm like, hey, I worked on those. But I'm always hesitant to take like exclusive credit, even if I'm the sole credited writer, because it is very much a group effort. And you can have a great script, and if it's not directed correctly, it won't sing. If it's not acted correctly, it won't work. If it's not edited or the score is wrong, people will, again, subconsciously or not, find reasons to say, I didn't like that. And so I'm very proud that I'm able to at least create that sort of like superstructure that people are able to operate at the top of their intelligence and do their best work with. And I think that that's the name of the whole ball game, really, is how do you empower other people to do their best to work as a team.
Yeah.
Now, is there
about
go ahead, Melissa.
No, I was just curious about the evolution of a writer's room. Now, does it vary from project to project? Are some more organic in creating the writer's room, or are some more, you're doing this, you're doing this, you're doing this?
I think every writer's room is different. It happens to be that the writer's room that I've worked on, the writer's rooms. Oh no, that's Daddy's earbud. The writers' rooms I worked in tend to be fairly meritocratic in that some are very hierarchical, almost like a military structure where the people at the bottom are not encouraged to talk unless they're openly said, what do you think?
Right.
I have never worked that way. I have found that I tend to get better results if I keep it kind of an open playing field where everyone is allowed to say whatever they feel at any time, and with the caveat that as the showrunner or the person running the room, I have to kind of play referee, and I'll just try to guide the conversation where I think there's something great, or I might have to say put a pin in that, but I have found that great ideas come from everywhere, and it's also a great way to train up people who might not have as much experience to gain the confidence and the skill sets they need to provide better work for you and for their own careers. So
Right.
that's a long-winded answer as to say that it's totally different for every TV show. There are some TV shows where it's all top down and it's just one dude at the top who's just like, this is my unfettered genius, make it work. But then there's others that are like, depending on who is in the room at the time, they're in charge. And we borrow a little bit of that because you can't just have unstructured play all the time.
Right.
You need somebody to kind of guide the room, and so that tends to be like how we'll do it, where the showrunners, either myself or the person who's the showrunner that I'm maybe head writer with, will usually guide the conversation, and then as the show, if we get called out for a meeting, we'll have somebody is at the producer level will run the room with clearer
Gotcha,
guideposts of what we're hoping to get by the end of the day or what have you. So yeah, I mean, that method I think is the best that works for how I interact with other human beings.
Yeah. Matt, what were you gonna ask?
Well, I was just gonna say, okay, obviously, it starts, the concept for, like, say, an episode starts with the writers, right? You, as a collective whole, which I absolutely love to hear that that's your process. Excuse me. Because I think it's so cool when you can get a group of people together and you're just bouncing ideas off each other, and then everybody gets excited about it until you finally come up, everything starts to kind of merge together, and then you get that, like, okay, yeah, we think we have something really good. So I was going to ask if there was something like, whether, whatever you've worked on since you've been doing this, was there one particular, like, episode that you were like, from start to finish, like when you watch the final product based upon your idea, and to see what everybody along the way did, where you were just like, oh my gosh, that nailed it?
You mean in terms of like how everybody kind of pitched together and then it
Yeah.
became
Like it
something
just
greater than
kinda-
all of us? Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, a great example of that would be like All the World's a Stage. Like I wrote that episode, but it was very much a group effort that kind of started, like it started with someone else's kernel of an idea. And I believe Deandra Pendleton Thompson brought in like this nugget of a kind of what they call a story area or a springboard of what if they arrived at a planet where they were kind of acting out, um, they were acting out old captain's logs, and then that opened up the discussion of like how would that happen, and then I think the Bensons maybe had said like, um, what if they were, at first we were saying maybe they were old transmissions, sort of like the movie Contact.
Yeah.
Oh
But
yeah,
then,
yeah.
they were like, oh, well, maybe it'd be easier if it was more um, a cultural contamination episode, which is at its heart anyway, and that which brought to mind the discussion of how they did that in TOS with the episode with the mobster planet,
Yeah.
a piece of the action.
Mhm.
You want off? She wants me to take my headphones out. Not right now, Momo. And then that I kind of jumped in and said like, well, what if it was literally a cultural contamination from TOS, because that was sort of how a piece of the action ended. What's wrong, Momo? Draw with markers. And so that oh, she wants markers. Give me a second.
Oh no, you're
Sure.
good. Yeah, do what you gotta do. I've been there.
Amazing.
Mine are old now,
Mhm.
and they still do that.
Here we go.
Ooh.
But anyway, so and then that sparked my thought of like, what if it was literally something from the USS Enterprise from the TOS era, like a lost episode where they,
Mhm.
because they kind of played fast and loose with the Prime Directive back then.
Yeah.
And the end of the PC action ended with this sort of dangling question mark of like, uh-oh, we left behind we left behind a tricorder. What would that
Right.
what's that going to do? And rather than just have it be a piece of the action sequel, we
Mhm.
thought, wouldn't it be more interesting if a one of the red shirts that they were constantly leaving behind on
Yeah.
a planet,
So great.
survives and
Mhm.
then wound up becoming this sort of cargo cult kind of figure in a planetary lore. And then that's, it took all these sort of disparate floating ideas that had been in the room and combining them into one story.
Mhm.
So
So
cool.
need help? Okay. Trying to get up on the couch.
Yeah.
Oh.
And so that was it was just kind of one thing on the other, and then
Mhm.
and then once we had arrived and as we were talking about it, it became a complicated episode, but I was like, I see it. And
Mhm.
I kind of took the lead breaking the story, and I was like, does anybody here want to write this episode? And everyone's like, sounds like you want to write the episode. So well, and that's the best when that happens, I think, because
Mhm.
it's a little bit like standing in a cathedral as it's built around you, and suddenly
Yeah.
you look around, you're like, look at this amazing thing that was kind of like
Yeah.
bubbling beneath the surface,
Mhm.
waiting to be excavated. It was great.
Oh, that episode is so great because it's
Mhm.
it's such great world building in a universe that's already been established. So you
Mhm.
get so much different, but very much the same. It's wonderful how you played with that, with a new idea, but keeping it fresh for Trek fans.
Mhm.
Yeah, what was nice too about for Prodigy in particular is it fulfilled the key mandate of our show, which one of the key mandates, I should say, which is introducing new and young audiences to
Mhm.
everything that's great about Star Trek. And we knew we wanted to do an episode that celebrated the original series in some way, and this
Yeah.
kind of provided a really great in-universe excuse to dive headfirst into it in a way that would be barely fit into a 22-minute format.
Mhm.
Well, I thought it was cool because it reminded you of the things that you found great about the original series. You
Mhm.
know, that this culture would find these logs, and from that, take the best parts of it and introduce that into their own society as kind of a rules of conduct and stuff. But then maybe took it just a little bit step further. It was like, not only are we going to emulate the morality of this civilization that we're watching, but we're also going to emulate them
Mhm.
in their their characteristics as how we interact as people.
Yeah, and that was something that we liked because as far as I know, almost every cultural contamination episode that has happened in Star Trek until that point tended to be focused on the negative
Yeah.
Mm,
consequences of exposure, which
yeah.
we felt was, that's certainly part of it, but there are positives that could emerge, and it was kind of fun to explore that through the lens of what would a copy of a copy of a copy of Starfleet look like,
Mhm.
and it kind of thematically for the whole show of our show boiled down to the essence of like, if you're just emulating Starfleet, what truly makes someone Starfleet. And
Yeah.
I think plenty of shows eventually arrive at the conclusion that it isn't necessarily about the number of pips on your collar. It's about whether you believe in the ideals it stands for, especially Deep Space Nine, where, there are a number of characters that are not in Starfleet that I would say more than embody what Starfleet is.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yes. And Prodigy has that in spades. It's so endearing. That particular episode for me, I love that episode. And Live Logs and Prosper is always wonderful.
Yeah. I'm glad that I could introduce I'm glad that I could introduce the Star Trek fandom to yet another even harder version of the salute to
But what do you hope for Prodigy's future? What is your ideal?
Yeah, well, I think that the blessing of Star Trek is it you just can't keep it down. It embodies one of those kind of unique those unique corners of the cultural sort of space. What's that? Yeah, you found a marker. Cool. Why don't you draw on the board?
Yeah, the couch is much better.
Yeah, it embodies one of those unique spaces where it's become an institution that people find value in returning to again and again. So my hope is, and I don't think it's an unusual or an outrageous one, is that Prodigy will find some way to continue in this space in some way, shape, or form, and Star Trek as a franchise has provided so many possibilities for that, whether it's another season or a film or ongoing storylines in other shows like Worf. Anything could happen, and I just hope that we get a chance to do more.
Amen to that.
Yes.
Well, season 2 was such a
yeah.
Well, season 2 was such a I don't know. I want to say masterpiece in a lot of ways. It is, for me at least, I mean, I can't speak for others, but it was one of the best seasons of Star Trek that I can remember in a long time.
Yeah.
I mean, you guys
100%.
hit.
Yeah, I don't think you're alone in that opinion. A lot of people have told me as much, and that I'm just glad that we didn't screw it up.
I'm glad we got to see it.
Yeah.
Yes.
So for a minute there.
So when you were starting on, the beginning, you're sitting down in the writer's room looking at season 1. Did you have any of season 2 in your percolating?
Yeah. As we were breaking season 1, we knew that we were setting up a lot of very complex ideas and storylines, and it became very evident to us pretty early on that we would not be able to nor should we wrap all of them up cleanly in 20 episodes, because otherwise it just would have felt rushed and not terribly satisfying. So obviously we ended season 1 with a number of sort of dangling unresolved questions, the fate of Chakotay, the fate of Solom, and we knew going in we would have to address both of those, and have talked at length throughout season 1 of how do you fix create a better future for Solom if they are this sort of powder keg of cultural schism. There's a cultural schism there of people who are sort of xenophobic and afraid of the outside world versus those who are open to new ideas.
Yeah.
1 second.
He's providing necessary guidance in the writer's room there.
Yes,
absolutely.
I was very excited that she found an orange marker. Just for those of you keeping score at home. And so yeah, we were thinking about these things, and there were a lot of we had talked through a lot of ways that they would have to unwrap, which is partially why we didn't want to rush it in season and try to wrap them all up by the end of the season, because it would have felt too easy in a way.
Right.
But then of course when it came to actually breaking season 2 with those ideas, we're like, oh, these are actually a lot more complicated than we thought. But we have to trust our audience, especially a Star Trek audience, that as long as we walk them through step by step logically where our characters are emotionally, then they'll go along with it. And that's sure enough, that's what we did with season 2, where, you know, I think I would argue that the time loop that we set up in Star Trek season 2 that retroactively applies to season 1 is one of the largest and more complex in all of Star Trek history, perhaps perhaps in all of science fiction in some ways.
Absolutely.
You know, maybe in on par with stuff like Primer, or, you know, our mutual friend Terry Metallis's 12 Monkeys.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, there is nothing quite as satisfying as a really well done time loop. And you guys nailed it. Like,
that is a perfect word, satisfying.
Yeah.
So I was just gonna say, like, you get to the point where they're like, wait a minute, and they start explaining it, and it's just like my brain, it was like massaging my brain. I was like, oh, that's the stuff right there. Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's the stuff that kept me, like, you know, 5th grade Aaron awake at night, just thinking about, like, you know, the Time's Arrow I've said has been one of my favorite episodes of Star Trek, specifically because it has those thorny questions of predestination and causality that I was like, so how old is Data's head? How many times has he gone through this time loop? Is it like 1,000 years old? Is it like infinite years old?
Well, as we ponder that question, how old is Data? We do have to wrap up, but we have the next video coming up, which is 455 Films, and they'll be talking about the Voyager documentary. I will put the link in the description box, but thank you for joining us, Aaron Waltke. It's always a great pleasure to speak with you and have you tell us all the ins and outs about the writer's room and Prodigy, which we love. I can say that for everyone, I think.
Absolutely.
On the screen, at least. We do love it. And then everyone in the audience, thank you for tuning in for Virtual TrekCon 6. There's a lot more content coming your way. The link to the next video is in the description box below, and I'll put it in the live chat as well. And thanks for being here.
Sure. And I should say that I'm also in the documentary To the Journey. So, you know, if y'all are interested in that, in Star Trek Voyager, I make a few little cameos in that documentary as well.
Oh, cool.
So, you know, all you Aaron Waltke fans out there, literally dozens of you, that's another thing to check out.
Fantastic.
Great.
That's really cool.
So we will see you soon. Okay, so the stream is ended.
Okay.
Yes.
Yay!
Thank you.
Glad it worked out. Sorry.